Welcome all to ASBMB's Protecting American Science and the International Collaborators Critical to Its Success webinar. It's hosted by ASBM's Public Affairs Department. My name is Serena Niote, and I'm the Science Policy Manager. We'll be talking about this issue and foreign influences in research integrity. I'll give a very brief 30-second overview and then introduce our guest speaker, Frank H. Wu. And at the end of the webinar, we will have a Q&A session. So feel free to raise your hand and I can unmute you so you can ask your question, or you can also type it in the web chat and I'll be sure to check that as well. So like I mentioned, very brief introduction. I'm sure you're all very familiar with this topic and how important it is. US scientists extensively collaborate with investigators in foreign countries, which is critical to scientific advances and contributing to the international scientific community. Unfortunately, there have been instances of theft of scientific ideas. Sometimes that means IP information has been stolen. Sometimes it's a matter of failing to disclose foreign support or violating the peer review process. So this webinar will review the policy landscape on this issue, and our guest speaker, Frank H. Wu, will discuss his perspective. He has a lot of the legal experience in this area, and he'll also be giving a brief introduction and background to himself. So Frank, go ahead.
Great. Good morning or good afternoon, depending on what time zone you're in. I'm humbled to be asked to speak to this group. We do have some PowerPoint slides for you to take a look at, so let's advance to who am I? So I'll just do a very quick little introduction. I'm a native-born U.S. citizen. I grew up in Detroit. My parents came to the United States in the 1960s as graduate students when they were welcomed. I'm trained as a lawyer. I have practiced law, and I spent about 25 years as a professor. I was dean of Wayne State University Law School in Detroit, and I was chancellor and dean of University of California Hastings College of Law, the unique standalone law school affiliated with UC System in downtown San Francisco. I just take a moment to say this because this is an area just fraught with suspicion. I'm a loyal American. I'm not a foreign agent. I'm not a spokesperson. I'm not a Chinese ethnic nationalist, etc. So I just want to frame things that I'm talking about everything from not only a legal perspective, but from an American perspective, interested in ensuring compliance with American law and protecting American national interest. Though, of course, there could be a robust discussion of what that is. Okay, so next slide. I have a little disclaimer. Every careful lawyer will do this. And this talk has really two pieces to it. One is policy. I want to explain what's going on out there in the world. You've read a little bit about this, I'm sure, in both the scientific press and in the mainstream press. But the other piece is very practical. At the end, there will be a slide with my email address on it, and you should not hesitate to ask any question on the call, and you may contact me afterward. So let me set some parameters for that, though. Every good lawyer doing something like this will say, we're not forming an attorney-client relationship, nothing here is legal advice, and don't disclose anything on this call about your personal circumstances, anything that's not public. That's just for your own benefit and protection. So you may be on this call because you have a situation or a concern. That's great, but for your benefit, don't just talk about that to all of us. All right, contact me later. Let me say something right at the top of this, which is meant to be very practical for you. So I am contacted all the time by people like you, PhDs, sometimes MDs, people mostly who are academics, who are professors someplace of every level of seniority, including those who have chairs and who are quite distinguished. And the people who contact me, I can say 100% of them need a lawyer. They all need to talk to somebody. And there are some misconceptions that I'll take just a minute to talk about that have to do with working with a lawyer. Here's a simple test for you to use, you and any of your colleagues. It's a 2-question test. It is not complicated. If you answer both these questions yes, you need to talk to somebody about the risks. That doesn't mean you're in trouble. It doesn't mean you're going to be prosecuted. It doesn't mean you should be suing anybody. It just means you need to just have a conversation to ensure compliance and to address any potential risks. The 2-question test is as follows. Question 1, do you receive any U.S. funding? That's NIH, any other type of funding from the United States? Or have you in the past? Or do you have any other U.S. government role? Are you a peer reviewer? So even if you don't receive funding, if you're a reader for NIH, or did someone want to say something? Okay, I think you're all on mute for now. Serena will unmute you at the end. You can raise your hand. You can use the Zoom function. Right, so that's the first question. The second question is, have you ever had any affiliation, now or in the past, with any Chinese entity? By entity, what I mean is anything at all, including a university. So we'll talk in a minute about how China is structured differently. But even if it's honorary, okay, even if it's a title and you weren't paid anything, maybe they reimbursed your expenses, or maybe they didn't even do that, okay? But especially if you've been paid anything, if you answer that question yes, so if you have any U.S. funding, any affiliation with a Chinese entity, you just need to think about what's going on, okay? That's irrespective of your citizenship. If we could go to the next slide, who should worry? Okay, which repeats this test. And let me just say before we move to policy, the university's lawyer is not your lawyer, okay? Often people say to me, well, you know, I'm working with university, and it's great. It's fantastic you're being cooperative. Just understand that they may be under pressure from the NIH, the FBI, the Department of Justice. They likely are being counseled by lawyers both inside and outside the institution. Doesn't mean they're hostile to you, but it does mean they're not operating in your interests. It's very easy to be lulled and to think that they're trying to help you. They may or may not be trying to help you. They're probably not trying to hurt you, but they're protecting their client, which is the institution. And hiring a lawyer doesn't mean that you want to sue anybody. Often I talk to people and they say, well, I don't want to sue anybody. What do I need a lawyer for? And I'll be honest, one of the things I think happens is people who are very smart, very talented, very successful, think they can work it out on their own. Here's an analogy. You wouldn't turn to me as a lawyer to address public health concerns related to coronavirus. All right? You wouldn't turn to me as a lawyer if you had a medical issue. So if you have a PhD, if you have an MD, and you're dealing with something that's actually legal in nature, the training you have, no matter how expert you are, won't help you address it. All right. So let's go to the next slide and let's start talking about policy and the issues. So this is a broad overview of 3 categories. I'm going to go into detail on each of these. All right, what are the issues out there? I would say there are 3 different issues. Okay, the first issue is there are violations of American law, American academic freedom, American norms. There is, and I always want to acknowledge this, there is espionage, there is theft. Some of it is on behalf of the Chinese government. Some of it's just self-interested, you know, just people looking to make a buck. Doesn't make it right, but those are different categories. So that's the first issue. You should be concerned about this if you run a lab, all right, and you have students coming in, visiting scholars, etc. Doesn't mean you should suspect them, but you should understand there are multiple cases when the United States government and the Department of Justice says this is happening. It is. I have no doubt. I've looked at these cases. I've studied this issue. There are non-trivial numbers of bad actors doing bad things. So that's the first category. Second category, though, and these are not mutually exclusive. Second category is false positives. There are people being wrongly accused whose careers are being ruined and who are facing a chilling effect. And their being targeted, and sometimes it appears they're being targeted because of race or ethnicity. So that also is a concern. That's the second category of problem. Third is policy change, and I want to spend a decent amount of time explaining this, where there were activities that you may have engaged in 10 years ago that were encouraged by your institution, even 5 years ago, even 3 years ago, and then were tolerated, then became frowned upon, then became prohibited, then became criminal. So this is an area of rapid change, and again, whether you're concerned about someone stealing from you or concerned about being accused of theft, understand there's a giant set of compliance issues here where the norms are changing. All right, let's go into some details. Next slide, please. Before this, we sent out some links. So you can click on some of those links. I just gave you a tiny sampling of what there is out there. So I want to start with first the real cases. There have been multiple convictions in plea deals and also civil litigation. Okay, so some of these cases are criminal cases, right? Meaning there's a defendant, there's a prosecutor. If the defendant loses, they will be found guilty of criminal acts. They will go to prison. Okay, so it's about as serious as it gets. Even though some of these are, there's a set of Latin terms that law professors sometimes use. Malum in se and malum prohibitum. You've probably never heard those phrases. That's fine. Malum in se are things that are intrinsically morally wrong. Murder, for example. Right? Every culture throughout history has said murder is wrong. Malum prohibitum are those things that are wrong because the state has passed a law that says they're wrong, but they may not have moral content. I'll give you an example. The side of the road that we drive on, if you drive on the wrong side of the road, you will be ticketed. If you do it consistently or if you do it while drunk, you might be criminally prosecuted, and actually is dangerous. If you drive on the wrong side of the road, you will hurt yourself and others. But there's no moral content, right? Some countries drive on the right, some countries drive on the left. No one looks at which side of the road you drive on and says, hey, that's like murder. Why do I point this out? Because some of these criminal cases are malum prohibitum situations. Which side of the road you drive on, you fail to disclose something, right? People might not say that has moral content. They might, though, in some instances, if you did it deliberately. But you can still be criminally punished. So don't think that it's got to be at the level of murder. Some of these things are accounting inconsistencies. You can be criminally prosecuted, okay, for various forms of misappropriation, wire fraud, etc. It's basically the concept is you're defrauding the government. Okay, so there are multiple cases like this. Many of them are in the academic world. Some are in the private sector, and some cross the border. It's an academic who is working also with a for-profit, which many of you probably are entrepreneurial, not uncommon. But many of these cases involve people who are taking some form of intellectual property and in some way sharing it or transferring it to the Chinese government or to a state-owned enterprise or to a private enterprise they've set up in China. And that's the crux of it. It's some type of knowledge that's being shared inappropriately in violation of some federal statute or policy. Okay, this also includes coordinated efforts. Okay, where it's not just one person, but it's a group of people who are involved in a systematic effort. So you've probably seen some of these headlines. Some of them involve people trying to take samples out of the country, physical samples, smuggling them. Some of them involve sending emails, sending plans, sending patented content, and so on. Okay. I've been studying this for a number of years. I think it entirely plausible that some of these activities are directed by the Chinese government. So when the Department of Justice says that, I think that's highly likely to be true of some, not all. Because when you look at it, some of these cases also are just people who want to make money. They've become very American, right? It's all about making a dollar, and they see an opportunity for themselves and they want to take it. And there isn't really convincing evidence that it's on behalf of or at the behest of or at the direction of the Chinese government, but it involves China in some way, which makes sense. The United States and China are the two largest economies, and if you're going to manufacture something or do something in this area, China is a natural place that you would think to go. The other aspect of this that's important to note is the expansive scope of Chinese government. So it is a totalitarian system. I'll give you an example. Every Chinese university is an entity of the Chinese government. So ordinarily, you don't think when you're collaborating with a Chinese professor, oh, I'm working with the Chinese government, right? Most people think of that as I'm working with a colleague who happens to be of Chinese background, who happens to be in China. But in fact, framed a little differently, you're working with the Chinese government. And if you're familiar, if you go to Chinese university campuses, there actually are Communist Party officials who hold high-ranking roles, and in some instances, they're more important than the people who nominally have the academic administrative role running the place. The party official is actually the power. Okay. Let me close out this first part about real cases by mentioning there's some various other issues. I'll just quickly tick them off. There are actually Communist Party cells being set up. You may have read about this. I don't mean metaphorically. I mean actual Communist Party operations, Chinese Communist Party operations being set up on some university campuses. There's peer monitoring of foreign exchange students, that is, Chinese students monitoring and reporting on other Chinese students. In particular, if in class or through social media, things are said about Tibet, Taiwan, Hong Kong, Xinjiang, other issues that are considered sensitive and against Chinese policy, such as, for example, the invitation at, there's a typo here, it says UCSF, it's UCSD, UC San Diego invited the Dalai Lama to speak. There then is an effort by Chinese foreign nationals to suppress that in some way. There's also punishment of Chinese students when they return to China for engaging in free speech activities in the United States. The University of Minnesota, foreign exchange student that is from China who came here, posted some images of Winnie the Pooh. You may not realize this, but Winnie the Pooh is banned in China because it's a way to satirize President Xi. That unfortunate student, when he returned to China, was imprisoned for 6 months. You know, his life has probably been ruined. And there are organized efforts by students seeking admission to commit fraud in test taking. I just mentioned all of that because there's a whole bundle of issues related to Chinese presence on U.S. campuses, and they sometimes get linked, whether appropriately or inappropriately. All right, next slide. So now let's turn to the second problem, false positives. So I've given you a couple of cases. Google them, take a look if you want. New York Times has done multiple stories, credible news sources, this is not fake news. 60 Minutes profiled the two people I have on this slide. They're not the only ones. So we're not talking one, we're not talking two, we're talking dozens of cases. Okay, I'm familiar with a number and worked with people who haven't been as prominent. These two, Sherry Chen and Xiaoxing Shi, have been in the New York Times, each of them, multiple times, front page coverage. So let me tell you a little bit about each of their cases as exemplary cases, but there are many more. Okay. Sherry Chen, U.S. citizen, naturalized, possibly like many of you or like members of this group or your parents, right? She came to the United States from China, became a U.S. Citizen, and works with the Weather Bureau, or worked past tense, right? She was a flood forecaster, right? She's not a PhD, she has a master's degree. She was accused of espionage, of sharing the information about the location of dams, which is considered national security. But it turns out she had all charges dropped. Okay, so she was being criminally prosecuted. If convicted, would have spent the rest of her life behind bars. On the eve of trial, everything dropped, meaning the government realized we're not going to win this case. She actually had been reported by some sort of jealous coworker, a coworker who was jealous, bigoted, or both, who, after Sherry had visited her elderly mother in China, reported her erroneously as a Chinese citizen and then said, up to no good. She has since won her Merit Systems Protection Board appeal. That's very rare. Something like 2% of the people win that. That's the system if you're a civil servant, that is, you work for the US government. But she's not been restored to her job. So her case is still pending. Xiaoxing Shi, you may have heard about him. He's been in the press. He's like you. PhD, senior professor, chair of the physics department at Temple University. Like Sherry, came to the United States, became a US citizen, has American-born kids, accused of trade secret theft. The FBI broke down his door, handcuffed him, hauled him away. If he'd been convicted, that would have been it. Again, rest of his life behind bars. That's how serious these cases are. All charges dropped. And it turns out when you look at the case, the government just didn't understand the science. They were looking at things that they didn't have the technical expertise to comprehend, and thought to themselves, well, this guy, Shi, appears to be sharing all this sensitive data in violation of US law. Again, entirely unfounded. All right. He is now campaigning about these issues, more power to him, but his scientific career is basically over. He is unable to get grants at this point. So for those of you in academia, you realize if you don't have the ability to secure grants, that's it for your research career. Next slide, please. So now we turn to the third area, which is it has an A and a B: double standards and changing standards. So I want to take a moment to talk about each. All right, double standards. You may remember 20 years ago, exactly 20 years ago, there's a fellow named Wen-Ho Lee, PhD physicist at Los Alamos, accused of giving away the top secrets of US nuclear weapons, held in solitary confinement. Ultimately, he pled to mishandling data, just like the director of the CIA, John Deutsch, who received much less threatened punishment and ultimately was pardoned. In Dr. Lee's case, and again, Google this, Google Wen-Ho Lee judge apologizes, and you'll see the federal judge from the bench apologized to Dr. Lee upon releasing him from solitary confinement and said the government misled me. Federal judges never apologize. You don't have to be a lawyer to realize a federal judge doesn't sit there in the marble courtroom and say to a criminal defendant, the government made a mistake on behalf of the United States, please accept my apologies. It just doesn't happen. Now understand, Wen-Ho Lee did do something wrong. He had data that he took home on his laptop computer. Not supposed to do that, okay? But he had the book thrown at him, as they say. There's a more recent case, Chunzai Wang. This case is just from a couple of years ago. He's a climate researcher for the US government. Again, you can look this up. The Washington Post did a great article about this case. All right, so what did this fellow do? 3 years in a row, he went to Ocean University, okay, as a visiting scholar during his summer vacation and taught. He gave lectures. Some of you have done this sort of thing. I've done this sort of thing. I have taught for Peking University 2 different summers. Right? So this fellow, Chunzai Wang, made $700 per year for 3 years. You can do the math. That's $2,100. He didn't report it. That's a criminal violation. Now, what's interesting here is in the past, or if it didn't involve China, this would not result in federal criminal prosecution like this and someone's career being ruined. Someone would have talked to him. He would have had to amend his filings, etc. However, he was criminally prosecuted. He pled, and he was sentenced to 1 night. And again, the federal judge expressed regret. You can pull up the transcript, and she says, I'm really sorry I have to adjudicate this case. Federal judges don't say that kind of thing. They don't say to criminal defendants, gee, I feel bad about your case that I've presided over. But that's what she did. Okay, next slide, please. So changing standards. This is the area that's going to be of greatest concern, I think, to all of you. So to understand this, the main area of contention, but not the only, right, but the main area is these talent recruitment programs, right? So China's not the only nation. You may know there are many, many nations that have some type of talent recruitment program or offer some type of incentive to work with that nation. Many of these are based on ethnic affinity, but not entirely. So you may know that China has recruited into its talent program people who are not of ethnic Chinese background at all. But it is heavily of ethnic Chinese background. Some of these are efforts to recruit back on a permanent or semi-permanent basis people who migrated to the United States. It's what scholars in immigration would call return migration, right? So someone who came to the United States, got their PhD, became a professor, received tenure, is now in their 40s or 50s, is more senior, they're of ethnic Chinese background, and China wants to recruit them back. So they offer incentives, right? Typically, these are financial incentives. They can be substantial. They can be the equivalent of your salary on top of your U.S. salary or money of that nature. It can set you up with a lab, a fancy title, a home, a chauffeur, etc. Okay, and it was considered an honor. So 10 years ago, even 5 years ago, and you can think back, those of you who are professors at your own campus, every American university wanted a Chinese partner. So they turned to their Chinese immigrant faculty and staff and said, who do you know? Can you help us develop an association with Peking University, with Tsinghua, with whoever in Shanghai or wherever they want a peer or an aspirational peer? So everyone's running around trying to set up exchange programs for professors, for students, etc. And talent recruitment programs are mixed up in all of this. And so as recently as 5 years ago, there was this massive effort. 2 or 3 years ago, with worsening U.S.-China relations, this became tolerated, then frowned upon, and now it is criminally prosecuted. So it's a very fast change, and I'll talk a little bit about the rhetoric in a moment. So what has happened is in late 2018, you may recall Attorney General Jeff Sessions. Ultimately, he and President Trump parted ways. One of his very last acts, one of the very last things he did while in office was announce the China Initiative. This is his announcement. It's not my interpretation. They said they wanted to announce new enforcement measures. They had a big press conference. They put out material on this. I want to highlight this. Why? Because one of the things that the Department of Justice and others say is absolutely correct, which is almost all these laws were on the books. Absolutely correct. But they weren't being enforced aggressively and in a targeted manner. That's what they announced in December, and that was a change. And they themselves came forward and said, we want to announce this big change. We want to make the world aware of this China initiative because of the espionage. There are a few things that have changed. So the Department of Energy, okay, that for this group, given your specialty, is not the main area you're concerned with, but there are proposals to extend this. The Department of Energy, a little more than a year ago, announced that it was now formally prohibited, not just kind of frowned upon, but there was a formal prohibition. It became a violation of the law to work for the Department of Energy and moonlight or have an affiliation with Thousand Talents. Okay, there have been proposals to extend that across the board to make it illegal to participate in a Thousand Talent program, period. Okay, and as you know, there are massive NIH and FBI investigations with universities being part of this. The New York Times said it was a few hundred. And according to published reports, the government won't confirm or deny because these are ongoing investigations, but it's highly likely that it's several hundred, okay, which means at every R1 institution, you've got something like this going on, targeting one or more faculty members. That doesn't mean they're all going to be in trouble, and there's a range, but the number of investigations is just staggering. Let's skip ahead 3 slides, the one that says rhetoric. Let's take that one now. Rhetoric, great. So I want to put this into context so you have a sense of what's going on. This is the end of constructive engagement, okay? You may remember in the early 1970s, there was ping pong diplomacy. It's called that because it started when an American ping pong player in Japan missed the team bus and had to hitch a ride with the Chinese ping pong team. Remember, the People's Republic and the United States did not have formal ties. They didn't have relations. The United States did not recognize Beijing, but instead recognized Taipei and the Republic of China as China. Okay, Red China, Free China, for those of you who can recall this era. Ping pong diplomacy led to normalization. So Nixon and Kissinger worked with Mao, and ultimately in 1979, under Carter, the U.S. and China established formal diplomatic ties. The United States recognized China. This was called constructive engagement. There was a hope then that engaging with China would lead to modernization, democratization, liberalization, whatever, however you want to frame it, and China being welcomed in to the rest of the world, right? So that would include a session to the WTO, et cetera. And it's easy to forget this now, given how fast China has developed, but China was considered then a third world or developing nation, high poverty, et cetera. In material terms, couldn't compare to the United States at all. So there was a constructive engagement era, and the idea was, let's engage with China. It will cause China to become more like the West, more like America. A couple of years ago, Stanford University's Hoover Institution published a report. And it was significant because it was written by several dozen China hands, China experts, people who study China, who were formally enthusiastic about constructive engagement. They called for constructive vigilance and said that China, with its rise, was using power, hard and soft power, in a very different way, and it was not becoming westernized, democratized, etc., but instead was attempting to overtake the United States. You've no doubt seen these headlines. There's a Harvard professor who wrote a book about the Thucydides trap. You may remember Thucydides was the Greek general and historian who wrote the history of the wars there. And the Thucydides trap is the notion that whenever you have a rising power globally and an established power, military war is inevitable or highly likely. So Graham Allison studied more than a dozen instances to ask, how can we avoid war between the United States and China? So it's not cultural war, trade war, actual shooting war. So there's a concern now. And organizations such as RAND have modeled what would military conflict between the United States and China look like. So I'll just give you a sampling of some of the rhetoric. FBI Director Christopher Wray said there's a whole of society threat from China to the United States, and he said specifically there are non-traditional collectors of data. This is the grains of sand theory. It's the idea that unlike cloak and dagger spies, James Bond type things, that what China is doing is taking ordinary people, foreign exchange students. That's who FBI Director Wray identified. Professors, right? Sort of people in your labs, on your campuses, and they're turning them into sort of amateur spies, each one of them not having anything of great value, but if you've got thousands of them, you can add it up and actually extract from it the equivalent of more systematic espionage. Okay. President Trump, as reported by reliable sources about a year ago at a private dinner, said almost all Chinese students coming to the United States are spies. not much was made of it. I've talked to some other people who said, well, he says a lot of things, right? So there are multiple express statements that Chinese people of Chinese background are more likely to be recruited to work on behalf of China, irrespective of their citizenship. There are some commentators who have said, it doesn't matter if it's a US citizen, if they're of Chinese ethnic background, they're going to be recruited by China to be agents of some sort. Now, you've seen recently with coronavirus being called Chinese virus, etc. This is all wrapped up in what's happening now. Let's go to the slide that says perpetual foreigner syndrome. So that's going to be back to context perpetual foreigner syndrome. Great. So very briefly, I won't spend much time on this. There's a whole history of this sort of thing, from the Chinese Exclusion Act, racial bar and naturalization, the internment of Japanese Americans, 2/3 of them native-born citizens of the United States. To think that if you're Chinese, you will always be Chinese. You can't really be American. You can't be loyal. Even if you hold a US passport, you're secretly working on behalf of China. I want to be fair here. There is a Chinese tradition that corresponds to this, which is to regard someone like me as what they call overseas Chinese, meaning that secretly I should be loyal to China. And so there's not a distinction made between cultural affinity, liking Chinese food, that sort of thing, or using the Chinese language, and political allegiance. So there is a sense of rising ethnic nationalism in China. And I don't doubt that some people will respond to that. But here in the United States, there's this long history of treating even citizens, naturalized and native born, of Asian background, not just Chinese, but for those of you who know this history, there was once an Asiatic barred zone. Some of you may be old enough, or your parents were old enough to have been affected by this. They couldn't naturalize, or a difficulty coming. The laws weren't finally changed until 1965. So that's within the lifetimes of many of us. Okay, let's go to this next slide, scale. So to understand this, we have to understand everything scales up with China and with Chinese. Since you are trained in a scientific field, you're comfortable with numbers. Not everyone is, and not everyone understands these numbers. Let me just show you a few of these numbers. There are, and this fluctuates, 350 to 375,000 Chinese students per year. Okay, let's use 350. That's an easy number. There are about 10 or 11x as many Chinese Americans, people who are US citizens. They happen to be geographically concentrated in California, New York. Asian Americans are the fastest growing racial minority group, and Chinese are the predominant part of that. It's continuing influx. Maybe some of you on this call belong to this category. Let's just think about the math for a minute and the difference between proportions and absolute numbers. Let's say hypothetically, and I actually had a conversation with someone who was a White House official with the National Security Council. I said, let's say 1% of the foreign exchange students are violating the law or intend to violate the law. The White House person said, that's a very high estimate. They wouldn't even claim 1%, but let's say 1%, okay? That means 99% are innocent. 99% are no different than students coming from France, let's say, okay? Yet, if we profile, we're going to blame 99% on the basis of ethnicity for the conduct of 1%. That doesn't seem right. But understand the absolute number would be a concern. 1% of 350,000 exchange students is 3,500. If there are 3,500 people coming here to engage in espionage or trade secret theft, that's a huge problem. So there's an issue here of absolute numbers versus proportion. Okay, let's go to the slide about prosecutions. Key takeaways here. So most of the people who have been implicated are ethnic Chinese. Some are US citizens, some aren't. But not all. The case that's been in the headlines is Charles Lieber, the Harvard professor. He's not of ethnic Chinese background. There's a fellow named Keith Gartenlaub, a bunch of cases in Florida. Now, they're all associated with China in some way. Lieber with Thousand Talents, Gartenlaub had a Chinese wife, etc., right? So there are these enormous disparities, whatever the intention. The investigations, they number in the hundreds, and understand what the claims are. Some of these start off as espionage or economic espionage claims. They then become failure to disclose or accounting error or wire fraud cases, which are also subject to criminal sanction. What's a failure to disclose? Failure to disclose is moonlighting or double dipping. Right? You're employed as a professor in the United States. You make $150,000. You agree to work in China. You sign an agreement. The Chinese agreement says you agree to work full-time in China for $150,000. The NIH and your US university employer look at that and say, wait a minute, this can't be. You can't work full-time here and full-time there. And under both the NIH grant and university policies, you need to report your outside sources of income. This is now regarded as criminal conduct leading to prosecution. It's a form of fraud. Okay, let's go to the next slide, and we're almost done. So, what are the effects here? So there's effect on the people who are directly involved, and those who aren't directly involved, potential violations of their civil rights, equal protection, due process, including fair notice of these changes. Okay, but even if you don't care about that, so let's say you say, yeah, that's not racism, I don't care, we need to protect U.S. national interest, absolutely fair. I would identify a couple of other concerns. That includes just the change in scientific norms. So the chilling effect, the deterrence on cooperative efforts, guilt by association. This is going to, just as coronavirus and social distancing is changing our social norms, these investigations are changing academic and scientific norms about how you work with others. There's also a problem of reverse brain drain or self-fulfilling prophecy. So let's say you didn't care about civil rights at all. Let's say you didn't care about academic norms at all. The concern here is that China will overtake the United States and that China will compete unfairly. The irony here is, and there are cases that I can point to, the change in the environment here, the glass ceiling, the potential bias, just the discomfort that Chinese immigrants feel may cause them to say, I don't want to be in San Francisco, I'd rather be in Shenzhen or Shanghai. And after they get their PhD, they don't stay, right? This is a watch what you wish for, getting rid of highly trained in America, Chinese PhD students and postdocs. That's actually not good for the US national interest, because if those people stay, they start companies in Silicon Valley, they become taxpayers, they raise children who, to their chagrin, become very American, etc. Right? So there are cases. There's the most famous case is the guy who's the subject of a book, Thread of the Silkworm, Dr. Chen. He was a U.S. Army officer, right, who was an immigrant from China. He worked on the Manhattan Project. He was one of the most junior scientists. He founded the Jet Propulsion Laboratory. Then he was suspected of being a communist, forced to return to China during the Cold War era. And he became the father of the Chinese rocket science program. So the irony here is this is a guy who wanted to be an American, who was in the US Army, who was at Caltech, would have been an American, but faced these false accusations and was driven to China, where he did things to help China develop its military might. That's a bad outcome, right? There are already, there was a story from last week, there are people who are coronavirus researchers who used to work in the United States, but because of this crackdown, within the past year, left and went to China, where they're now working at Chinese schools researching coronavirus. Again, to the extent that you want to divide the world and think of science in a nationalistic way, this is probably not a good outcome. Okay, let's go to the conclusion slide, please. So the conclusion that I would offer is that there are issues for us to be concerned about. I hope this has been useful to you, and I raise 4 things here. The first is, these issues aren't mutually exclusive. What I mean by that is trying to root out inappropriate espionage and trade secret theft on the one hand, and protecting civil rights and due process and being fair on the other hand. Those are consistent. It just requires not stereotyping people. So that's my broad point as an advocate. The questions I would ask is, how do we address these on our campuses? And I think it requires scientists such as yourself and scientific organizations to be interested in science policy. And I commend you for taking this seriously and having an office that addresses science policy. How do we promote compliance and education? Because many of these rules are changing, and this is just my opinion, I think it is true that some people didn't take seriously until the past year some of the disclosure rules, whether that was for bad reasons or just negligence. I don't know. I'm not here to judge that, but the NIH says, and I agree with them, there's a real compliance issue out there. There are lots of people who, for whatever reason, have not complied. Now, the truth is, most people, separate from this issue, don't read hundreds of pages of agreements and fine print to know exactly what the rules are. That's why there's a compliance office, a research office on most campuses. And the last issue I would raise is, most broadly, what do we want our policies to look like? Do we want to prohibit any type of cooperation through participation in talent programs? Do we want to allow it? Or is there a more nuanced view that says cooperation is good, theft is bad? And how do we distinguish cooperation from theft when there may be very different views of which is which? So that's my presentation. In the last slide, give you my email address. I'll say it, and then let's open up for questions. We've got about 12 minutes left. My email is frankhwu@mac.com. That's frankhwu@mac.com. And it must have my middle initial, or it's an irate guy in Hong Kong. Truly an honor to talk to you about these issues. And Serena, let's open up for questions. And as I said, if you want afterward to contact me privately, please go ahead and do that.
Of course. Thank you so much for that fruitful and detailed explanation of the policy environment here. So for questions, you can either raise your hand and I'll be happy to unmute you. You can speak freely, or, and I see we already have 2 questions on the chat. So I'll start with the chat, and if you have any other questions, you can add it or raise your hand. So the first question from Terry: the hard question about full-time is over summers. Faculty feel they are free in summer to work other places. How is that viewed? They think they do not have to disclose what they do for another employer to their U.S. university.
Yes, they might feel that, but they almost certainly have to disclose it for 2 different reasons. The first is there's almost certainly a university policy, a faculty policy that contains some sort of upper limit. I'd be shocked if there were a university that did not have that. I'm at a law school. We don't have external grants. Typically, we have a policy. We're allowed to do 20% outside remunerative work, meaning for pay, as distinguished from pro bono or anything like that. It is written down. That's the first source of this. You almost certainly have a university employee handbook, faculty senate rules. And if you poke around, it's probably even on your school's website. There is almost certainly a formal rule. If it's not there, if you have an NIH grant or any federal grant, they all contain a provision to the effect that you can't double dip, you can't have two sources of funding for the same project, be doing the work for somebody else, and you must disclose. That's in there in every federal grant that I'm aware of. Somewhere there is a reporting requirement, and there are conflict of interest forms. I'm sure if you have any type of grant, now here's the thing: you yourself might not have been the person filling it out, but someone probably put it in front of you to sign, either someone in your lab or a university office that's in charge of research compliance is looking at these things. And some of it has nothing to do with China, right? Some of it, you may recall, about 25 years ago, Stanford and a lot of other universities got in a lot of trouble over accounting. So some of this, unrelated to China, is just the federal government wants to track what happens to its money. So there are two sources for this: your university and whoever your grantor is. And even if you're getting private foundation grants or that sort of thing, almost certainly there's a reporting requirement, almost certainly there's a provision. Now, here's the catch. You have to look beyond just that provision to see what the penalty is, because it is not true that the penalty is always you're going to go to prison. Sometimes the penalty is some sort of adverse effect on your employment, right? Or it's a civil sanction. But those are the two sources. Take a look there, your faculty rules or handbook or whatever it's called at your school, and then whatever the documentation is for your grant, it will be in there. Okay, next question.
Sure. So the next question is from Chris Pickett. You advised people who have received funding from non-US governments to talk to a lawyer about disclosure issues. But some faculty members have foreign partners who want to come from China/elsewhere to do a sabbatical in the US. How concerned should these faculty members be about becoming a target of federal investigations?
Very. So, I want to strike a balance here. On the one hand, it would be onerous and terrible if every professor had to get a lawyer to help them at all times, right? That's not a world we want to live in. And so you have to be mindful of the risks. On the other hand, we don't want to make things so burdensome that scientific research just grinds to a halt. Imagine what would happen if foreign exchange students, visiting scholars stopped coming. And imagine if just in particular, Chinese stopped coming. That would be a huge change in your graduate admissions numbers, in who you have as doctoral students, in your postdoc pool, right? If people of Chinese background vanished overnight, packed up and went home, or were driven out, whole departments would collapse, right? So how concerned should they be? Everyone should be concerned. The institution should be concerned. And whether you personally are concerned or not, I assure you, your university general counsel's office, HR office, international office, all of them are concerned too. For those of you who joined this call, I want to commend you. It's great that you joined this call. It's terrific that you have this interest. I have a tiny suggestion, which is these issues are issues in common and through your organization. This organization sponsoring the webinar, you could think about this more broadly and think about, do we want to make a statement? Do we want to propose something? Because what's happening now is you have all these different cases, all these different people, all these different concerns. There was the Jason report, and there are some efforts now to have a scientific voice heard that strikes a balance. We need more of that. We need scientists to come forward and say, look, here's what would be a reasonable policy from a scientific perspective that on the one hand welcomes collaborators that we want to have, but on the other hand prevents people from walking away with intellectual property that appropriately belongs to the United States or belongs to me.
Okay, great. There's one person who raised their hand for a question, so they should be allowed to talk.
Hi. Person with question?
Yes, this is Alice Huang. I know that Ray of the FBI had promised that he would set up a committee composed of scientists and other policymakers in order to look at and determine what are some of the best policies that we should have for those of us who collaborate with Chinese colleagues. Can you tell us a little bit more about how this is going and if it's moving along the way it should, and is the OSTP involved, all of that?
Yeah, great question. Is this Alice of Caltech?
Yes, this is Alice Huang from
Hi,
Caltech.
great to have you on this call. So there are multiple efforts now, and there are efforts of Asian American organizations to work with the NIH and the FBI. I am cautiously hopeful. There is also an effort in Congress. There are some members of Congress who have introduced some proposals that would add oversight, add some protections, and try to address some of the racial profiling. I'll also be candid. I would never speak for the FBI or NIH. I have no right to do that. But I've been on panels. I've interacted with them. Their perspective is, I think, I can sum it up as, there's a very serious problem. That problem comes from China, and we're not profiling anybody. The disproportionate representation of people of Chinese background is due to the disproportionate numbers of those individuals as bad actors, right? In other words, it's not racial profiling, that's just the reality. Now, there are some prosecutors and investigators who have said expressly that ethnic Chinese pose a greater threat because of their likelihood of either being loyal or being recruited. So let's put it this way. There is pressure, and that's good, on the government to address the concerns of racial profiling. I am not sure that that pressure is sufficient to cause them to actually change their conduct. So it may be that additional pressure is needed, because I can say personally, when I've engaged these efforts, the response has not been positive. To the contrary, it's been sort of dismissive. Why are you talking about racial profiling? This isn't racial profiling. We're not bigots. We're just investigating the people who are doing bad things. And the people who are doing bad things happen to be people of Chinese background. So that's why I say it will take more of an organized effort, including from scientists, not necessarily from Asian American advocacy groups, right? Because the Asian American advocacy groups look as if they're self-interested. But to my knowledge, there are ad hoc efforts. There have been informal community meetings. There's been outreach. There have been meetings with the FBI. There have been meetings with NIH. But it is not, to my knowledge, resulting in significant changes. If anything, if you follow the news in this area, there have been multiple recent announcements of impending ramp up in investigation and prosecution. So if anything, I would say it's going the other way. There have been express warnings. We're really, if you thought we were serious before, we're going to become even more serious. And universities are caught in the middle, and most of them are capitulating to the pressure. And many offices of general counsel, so that would be the legal office at the university, they're adding lawyers who just do this, who just do cooperating with the NIH and FBI on investigations, because the caseload is just so big and so intensive. But what's happened is universities have been recruited to be the investigators and enforcers. I think we're out of time. but I'm happy to take an additional question. And as I said, I'm happy to talk to you offline. I want to thank Serena for putting this together. I want to thank all of you for joining. It truly has been an honor to be a part of this. Serena, back to you.
Yeah, of course. Thank you so much for taking the time to talk with us. Like, this is something that we definitely think is a very important issue, and we're tracking, and I've collected a lot of materials on this. So if any of you have any questions or suggestions, please feel free to reach out. My email address is there as well. But other than that, thank you for the time. Thank you, Frank, for taking the time to talk to our members. And I hope all of you stay safe and healthy.